let's talk about David Zeb Cook, designer for Dungeons and Dragons for many years, and talk about why I think he is a great adventure designer. This is probably the first controversial entry in this series because of, one, what Zeb Cook is probably most remembered for amongst players, and two, what people might think about some of his adventures. He is best known and most influential for being the lead designer of 2nd edition of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And some people really don't like 2nd edition. I love it. It's a great edition. It's much underrated, I think. And the reason that I think people are bothered by it is because of other things about what happens in the 2nd edition era. Mostly to do actually with the adventure design. To some degree, people also don't like kind of splat bloat, but mostly it's about how adventure design does go downhill for many years. Cook also wrote, though, a lot of adventures during this time in Basic 1E and 2E. I think from 1980 to 1994 he writes a lot of adventures. And when you look at the sheer quantity of well-known or important modules that he wrote, it seems to me he at least has to be considered. When I did blog articles on the best adventure designers, in my opinion, he was not in the top tier. I think he might have counted as an honorary mention, which was kind of category 3 basically. And I think there was lots of good stuff in his work, and I think he's worth talking about. And I think I've probably developed an appreciation over time for him anyway in the last year and a bit since I wrote those. I've previously in this series defined great designers by 3 qualities, and I mean you could come up with your own, but it's an attempt to say, well, why are they great and why are they important? 1, innovation, originality, which can be misconstrued as it's just good for someone to come up with random new stuff. I don't mean that. I mean people who really help expand the possibilities of adventure design. Excellence, like execution, how well they execute things, that's the 2nd category. And 3rd, quantity, if you write 1 good adventure, you're a more limited designer in these stakes than if you write 10 good adventures, because the 10 good adventures will do different things and iterate things more and in that sense be more important in the tradition. Cook, how does he rate? So he wrote, I've got, let's have a count, 9, 10, 11, 12, something, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I've got about 20-ish adventures on this list. I don't own all of them in physical copy, and some I have not read, and I will tell you as we go what I haven't read or know very little about. So I think the first module to come out in tournament form was A1, Slave Pits of the Undercity. I don't have a copy of that. The A series gets, it was a set of 7, I think, technically linked scenarios across A1 to 4 as published or later. A1 to 4 Scourge of the Slave Lords in a combined edition with expansion and changes. And I think if you're going to get them, it's worth getting Scourge. I think A1 by Cook is the most interesting of these. They are very linear in the sense they are tournament scenarios where you want to go from one thing to the next. They're road scenarios. Basically, tournament scenarios take 2 forms. One is the dungeon scenario, and you look at S3 or S4 for that, or S1. Basically, Gary does these dungeon scenarios. You go into a weird, difficult, complex environment, and you go around doing whatever it is you're doing. And then you've got the road scenario. One example of that, and a very good one on the whole, is To the City of Brass by Rob Kuntz. But the road scenario is another typical tournament scenario thing where you're scoring points by going through challenges. And A1 basically has you going to a city, investigating in that city through a set of various incidences, and then ending up in the Undercity, in the Slave Pits of the Undercity, because it is called A1, Slave Pits of the Undercity. And it's the stuff in there is pretty interesting. It's something where what you see with the combined edition is an attempt to make it more open, and that's the correct decision because there are things to do. It's still, even in the combined edition, it's still got some very linear elements where something just has to happen for the adventure to continue in a way that's not particularly fun for the players necessarily. So yeah, A1. I think if that was the average of his work, you'd see him alongside a lot of other okay early to mid TSR sort of designers, your Alstons and indeed your Schicks and people like that, where you're like, oh yeah, I didn't mind that module, but you wouldn't really think much about him. B6, the Veiled Society. This is actually slightly later. Let's try to go semi chronologically. I1, Dwellers of the Forbidden City. This, on the other hand, is a great module. It's been readapted into Tomb of Annihilation in 5th edition era. Yuan Ti and stuff in a ruined, abandoned city, as essentially the bit in front of the Tomb of Annihilation. It's, I think, really very good. One of the best AD&D modules from 1st edition, hasn't it? It's in a top 5 or 10, probably in the top 5 for me. Basically, the great thing about this is how open it is. There are some kind of potential ways of getting in, but once you're actually at, I will do a review of this at some point. Once you're actually at this big locale, you can just go in. There's loads of different entrances with loads of different challenges and loads of different factions, some of which you can even work with. Lots of dangerous factions, but some you can work with. And lots of different options for what you do. Lots of, at the time, this doesn't really matter to us as much, but many pages of new monsters too. 4 pages of new monsters. And this is an interesting thing. 1 page, which is just 5 adventures, or no, a page and a half. Backgrounds for going there and potential further adventures on top of your background to going there. New locales you could develop. It is a whole kind of campaign supplement in 32 or 28 pages even, and the sort of the Conan feel, and we'll get to this will come back up again. The sense of a Conan-like adventure is, I think, probably never bettered in D&D. It is, the idea you go to this rather nasty Red Nails-ish environment, in fact, in some ways, and you've got to work your way through. You've got to deal with different factions, different obstacles. Everything is sort of dangerous and different in this overgrown ruin. Very, very good. Around the same time, 1981 republished 83, and I'm pretty certain, because this is trademarked 83 or copyrighted 83, this is the reprint, Isle of Dread X1 by David Cook and Tom Moldvay, which my impression is Cook's name is first on it, and in terms of their design, it feels like a Cook design, but it's both of them, to be clear. They're both credited. The other time we think of Cook being co-credited, Moldvay being co-credited in that way, of course, we might think of Palace of the Silver Princess and the butchery job that Moldvay did on that in the re-edit. X1, also rightly well beloved. I think it's really interesting, by the way, to read reviews which worry about it not having a plot or a focus. Much like I1. The idea is something which just, you can see no one cares about at this point. You make adventure locales and the DM finds reasons for people to go there. This is, again, a really good adventure. One of people's favourites, one of the all-time greats. And definitely, if you've read I1, then you will feel like this, as I say, this is something the same guy. It has a weakish final dungeon. Like, it's a X1 because it's part of the expert set and it's introducing people to expanded wilderness play. So the B series, if you think B1 and 2 at least, are both to a significant degree. B2 adds in a mini city, but they're both, here's a big dungeon to explore, and they're both theoretically helping the DM to learn how to run dungeons. But yes, X1 is wilderness play. It's interesting, by the way, how the B series ends up essentially running over all of the X series' major tropes, just at a lower level by the time you get to B10 at least. But yeah, X1, wilderness play, you go to the lost world of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, basically. It's an early module to give any real details about Mystara, the Hollow World, with information about stuff on the mainland of the Hollow World, so the Grand Duchy of Karamakos, most famously, Galantry, places like that. And you go there. There's a settled area. There's some islands around the edge. You can go around exploring different places. There's no need to do any particular thing. You can go and find out some pirates. You've heard there's some pirates on the coast. Go and deal with them. You can go around trying to find places to land, but it's quite tough to land on the coast. Eventually, you are likely to go through the gate at the top of the civilized peninsula, or semi-civilized peninsula, and you then off you pop. You go and adventure around an island with lots of things, and eventually you get to potentially to a plateau in the centre, and in the place you might end up going there is because you ally with some locals there. They tell you about the cannibal locals who have rebelled and separated from them and are in a temple. You go and explore the temple, and there's some monsters called the Kopru. That doesn't work quite so well, that very end bit, but it is, as a wilderness adventure, iconic, and for good reason, because it is very, very, very good. Very, very, very good. Partly just there's lots of fun, interesting encounters and things. One thing I really appreciate is that essentially there's an entirely different humanoid ecology. There are 3 ancestries of demi-humans or humanoids who you deal with. There's the Thanaton, who are like raccoon halfling people who live in tree huts. Tasloi, of course, come up here on the same note. But Thanaton, there's Rakasta, who are tiger people who ride saber-toothed tigers, and they're kind of more nomadic. And then there's the Aranea, I think they're called, who are spider people with gigantic brain sacs on their back, which is a fairly creepy image, and like spider hands, which turn into like spider arms, which turn into hands. And I think that's just, in itself is a sign of a creativity and an expansion of the world. Partly because even in AD&D, when you think 1981, what big wilderness adventure had there been? None, really, when you think about it. Because with Homlet, you go from Homlet just to a place. You go to the gate, the moat house. You have a bit of a village adventure with some things nearby. But in the book itself, there's not much detailed. In the Slave Lords, yes, it's wilderness, but you're just going between locations, aren't you? And with B1 and B2, there is a micro wilderness that Gygax kind of says, oh, here's a couple of locations you can go to, but again, very little detail. More or less next chronologically, I'll check the dates. It's only going to be probably B4, B6, the Veiled Society, and X4 and X5, which are the Desert Nomads stories by Cook, which are, I have only glanced at them ever, and I think they're not highly rated amongst all the X modules, but they're not bad from my own memory of them. B6, the Veiled Society, this is a really important thing, I think, because it's the first city adventure, really. And not the first city supplement, that's City State, the Invincible Overlord, etc. But by adventure, I mean something which says, here's a situation in a locale, and the city adventure as intrigue and investigation kind of adventure. That's how I define it. If you see dungeon as controlled, limited environment, you go around, it's very much about mapping out things and dealing with a constrained space and time. Wilderness, you're going around a wider area, and more about exploration, less about, and Gygax makes this point indeed, less about some of those other things. And then the city adventure is intrigue, investigation. I think, B6 is probably the first in that subgenre. And it's a pretty good adventure. I think you sometimes see it seen as very linear, and it's not terribly linear, at least if you're willing to. You often get in these B modules and X modules, particularly the B modules actually are really guilty of this, even early on, of like, oh, the players will need to go here, so tell them this. And not opening up the game, because the idea is it's meant to be a training module, so not opening up the game to the DM and the players thinking their way through things. But B6 has a couple of decent dungeon spaces with the kind of solid, looping, interesting maps typical of the time. And it also has factions. It has a mystery where you're trying to find out which of these houses did something. And I think B6 is an important landmark, and that is a Cook landmark, and I think it's worth, crediting him with that at least, even if you didn't yourself like it as the best city adventure. So we've done I1. Yeah, a couple of modules I have not read and will not read from around the same era. M1 or M Solo 1, Blizzard Pass, CM4, Earthshaker, and CB1, Conan Unchained. M Solo 1 Blizzard Pass, Dave Bambara, I think it was in White Dwarf, said it was basically quite poor compared to Fighting Fantasy. It's a solo adventure, but it's not anywhere near as good as Fighting Fantasy. CM for Earthshaker. No one really likes the companion modules, do they, from the Beck Me era, and essentially it's the classic high-level adventures that don't, or relatively high-level adventures that just don't work, that don't have challenges commensurate to the player's ability, either as their characters or as themselves, and which often rely on a kind of heavily linear and directed sort of game style. CB1 Conan Unchained, not read it. What I thought was interesting when I was looking up about it was that Rick Swan, the designer Rick Swan, who's one of those very average, sometimes even okay, often forgettable first and second edition designers, he basically thought it proved that Conan and D&D didn't mix because the necessities of a Conan adventure were very different. And that's so ironic, isn't it, given that I1 is a Conan adventure. Conan Unchained is kind of bad and forced in Swan's view, and doesn't capture the feel of the kind of Conan gritty, dangerous adventure, whereas I1 does. One thing is, of course, that, and this is actually a general comment about the Conan thing, is that Conan, of course, there is a degree to which you can't make Conan adventures unless you are saying, well, basically you can have an 8th level character, but you'll be facing 2nd level challenges, and really you're there just to kind of see how well you can do. D&D works on a scale which is different to the one or two characters of that kind of adventure genre. Same with Fafnir and the Grey Mouser, because it's a party thing. Then again, you can run adventures for 2 characters, you just need to design around it. And so, yeah, I thought that was interesting anyway. Those are all badly rated, no one likes them. Moving on to much better rated things by him. He wrote 3, or co-wrote 3 Oriental Adventures games, modules, including, well, plus the book itself. OA, the book, the rulebook, is by Gygax with Cook and Florian, whatever his name is, the French guy. And really, actually, OA1 was largely drafted by Cook, redrafted by Gygax, adding in stuff he wanted, and then, yeah, left like that. It's a Cook book. One thing it doesn't have is any sort of meaningful setting, and this is the same, actually. You would think this was an Odyssey of 1.5 edition, because it's really the 1.5 book along with Unearthed Arcana, the 1.5 edition publishing mistakes or whatever, but it's exactly the same thing that happens with Arabian Adventures, the Al-Qadim stuff, so it is intentional. But yes, Swords of the Daimyo is OA1, and this is really the default setting. It is 3 adventures, is it? I feel like it's got a province book, which is the setting, and then it's got an adventure book, which is 3 modules. One of which is for Westerners, 7th level Westerners to turn up, and the other 2 of which are for locals, like 2 connected things. This is really good. Swords of the Daimyo is, I mean, the modules are all okay, not amazing. You can see a lot of potential in them. Particularly the 2 local ones, the Black Temple ones. But when you look at the province book is, and I wouldn't normally say Gazetteer was a adventure module per se, but there is so much adventurable stuff. It's more like Domhnwood in that way. You're like, okay, so Domhnwood is a Gazetteer, yes, but it's also definitely an adventure in the sense there's so much to do there. And then you've got your 2 local modules here. Combining the 2, you have a very, very good start to a campaign. And I think there's some reason to see this one, OA1 Swords of the Daimyo, as, along with I1 and X1, his best modules, his big modules. Knight of the Seven Swords, he does one section of this collaborative work, which has really interesting isometric maps, classic trifold kind of folder, lots of things to do. It isn't necessarily an amazing story. It does have another province in it. It's not necessarily an amazing story, but it is a pretty fun game. You know, it's something where you could probably steal from it better than anything. He also did OA4, Blood of the Yakuza, which is, and this is going to be relevant for some of the 2nd edition stuff we're about to move on to, really interesting, and I think OA4 actually may even, I'm not sure, OA5, 6, 7 I think are all 2nd edition technically. But really, we're at the turning of the tide, you know. At this point, Cook is the lead designer, and this is in his setting, and it's moving into the edition that he designs. So it doesn't really matter either way, you can see which way things are going. It's interesting to see that what happens is it's a set of interlinked stories, which is sort of like East Asian fables, basically, and they're each set up as having kind of rather than saying here is what happens in the adventure and here are the locations. It is, in a literal sense, plot driven. By that I don't mean pejoratively. I just mean it says here's the things that happen. This is the way characters might get involved. These are the things they might do. These are the interactions they might have, and so it's laid out very differently to what we expect, I guess, from say from OA1, where the Black Temple stuff is here's the setup and here's where they might go to here's the location, which is the classic earlier edition format. So in one way you could see OA4 as like Ravenloft, maybe betokening a bad development, even if it's good in itself. But OA4 is interesting. I need to kind of have a deep think about how good it was, but I think it's at least interesting, and an attempt to use the D&D rules to explore a slightly different kind of game, for good or for bad. And I think he does some good things with it. We're now more or less onto second edition, and there are a couple of he writes less in second edition technically. I guess he's doing a lot of rules stuff, but I mean from 87 to 94 or whatever, he's still with TSR. He designs the main books themselves, and is, I think, in a senior design position throughout. He leaves in 94 after Planescape. He publishes in lots of. He doesn't. I can't think of him ever publishing in Spelljammer. Correct me if I'm wrong. But he publishes in basically the other novel settings of the time, and I think it's really interesting that he stretches his wings out. He does design also in Forgotten Realms and Greyhawk. So in Greyhawk, it's just WGA4 Vecna Lives, which is a bad high-level adventure, most infamous perhaps for starting with a railroaded Circle of Eight scene where the players play the Circle of Eight, but they have to die. So you're told as the DM to cheat. And there's much more of the same. Essentially, it's fairly linear, not wholly, but fairly linear, and players are kind of expected just to do stuff that the module requires of them. To play within the options the module gives them. High-level modules are hard, and Cook, I don't think, ever designs a really good one. We've said CM1 Earthshaker, for instance, bad. And I think that's interesting, I think, because very few designers really successfully design to high levels. I've said Huso does, Cordell does, Gygax does to a limited degree. Gygax actually doesn't design very much at the top end of the range. And there are a few. I mean, it's something where you end up realising Skip Williams, of all people, designed some of the more passable high-level modules, because at least there's stuff you can do in them. You end up feeling like, okay, well, at least this works. So maybe it's no shame. I think, and I've never designed a super high-level module, really. So I couldn't say, but I suspect the challenge as a designer, not as a reader of the module, but as a designer, the problem you're facing, I suspect, is not just, how do you challenge players, because you can to some degree just ramp up having bigger monsters or whatever. But I think making it so that players can use their power sets in a way that is interesting to the players and isn't simply trivial. Oh, okay, I guess I cast the spell. You want it to be something where they're still being challenged with their resources, but the resources are no longer low-level resources, but the high-level resources of magic items, spells, alliances, large amounts of gold, things like that. So, yeah, Vecna Lives bad. A couple he contributes to. Ruins of Zentil Keep is actually pretty solid. I don't actually know which bits he wrote of that off the top of my head, but Ruins of Zentil Keep is one of the Forgotten Realms ruins, or similar kind of named box sets, which are often some of the better early second edition into the early 90s modules, which are just these quite solid affairs which aren't always very complete or wholly, you need to add to them, but they're often at least interesting. You see it with Ruins of Mithranor or Ruins of Undermountain by Greenwood, which are two interesting modules too. And this connects to a different thing, to what's it called, Ruins of Adventure, which was connected to the game, the video game, Pools of Radiance. He's one of 4 contributors. He did 1 section, I think. And there's a weird thing where you could get clues for Pools of Radiance by playing through Ruins of Adventure. This is bad interoperability and synergy, I think, I would argue. at various levels, and I think it should be fairly obvious why. But it reminds one of the way in which Magic and D&D now have to synergize for Wizards. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but you get your products together, you make people buy both. That's the classic thing. And I think, yeah, Ruins of Adventure is pretty forgettable stuff. First Quest is a related thing, which was tapes. Was it tapes or CDs? You'd listen to, and it was basically a way of training a DM to run the game. And it had adventure bits. It told the DM what to do. It's programmed. I wouldn't. So it's not. Is it really a module if it's so heavily programmed? Well, I mean, there are pretty programmed modules that are definitely modules. They're just not very good ones. Many people, I think, would have said that it was actually a pretty good training module. Something that was quite explanatory of what you should do and how you should run the game. So it's an interesting gimmick, at least. Then the main kind of block of second edition stuff, and this kind of shows, apart from Vecna Lives, you're talking about a couple of things he contributes to, or and I think First Quest he's also only a contributor. You know, you're talking about mostly products which are not his module or are not fully standalone modules. He does, apart from Vecna Lives, 4 other modules that I can think of or know of in the second edition era. I don't think he does any early Dungeon magazine things. And in Dragon, I think he might have written one thing. I'm not sure. He writes, and I think this is the first chronologically, 2 Dark Sun modules. This is Freedom, in the innovative Dark Sun format, which you get in the core set as well, with these. And he writes, that's DS1, then he also writes DSQ1, Road to Uruk. Road to Uruk, I have run. I've run Freedom and Road to Uruk and Arcane Shadows actually as well, DSQ2. And I have a lot of affection for them. I think I now recognise that there's 2 things. One, they suffer from a certain legitimate real linearity. By that I mean things that need to happen. Freedom has the particularity that it has essentially a prologue, which is that the players need to be captured and enslaved. Like, it's a bit of a classic in that sense. It's horribly reminiscent of his first module, isn't it? The players must be captured. The players cannot be free. It also has something which kind of connects to other metaplot games of the time, and I'm thinking really of things like the Giovanni Chronicle in Vampire. This is much better than that. But the idea that really high-level characters do the most exciting thing, and low-level characters just do something else. Here, they actually do have real things they do, and the things they do are fun. And there are options in there. And certainly when you're in the camp and you're trying to work stuff out, there are options. But I think that's the thing. In Freedom, the linearity comes from you have to go and be in the prison camp as a slave. You don't have to do this and this. These are the things that happen or could happen. And there are some options within that, but it's something which is quite constrained. And the real action, the overthrow of the Sorcerer King, is something which the players don't directly do anything to do with. They are merely assistants. Road to Uruk is more interesting on that level because there is a wide range where you need to go and recruit allies for the army, and they then become the player's battle system units. Because you're going to go to war against Tamanu of Uruk, because Tamanu of Uruk wants to come and punish you for having had a revolution. And so that bit is quite interesting, where you're like, oh, well, let's go and do basically a social adventure with combat elements. You have to go and please different factions or displease them, get different troops in, maybe improve them so they're better than their default is. Then it becomes literally linear because you're on the road to Uruk and you're a scouting unit, I think, from memory. And so you end up in lots of kind of actions, small fights, and then part of the big battle. But that's something where it's fair to say that what you're doing player-wise is more limited. You know, there's much more limited range of action. And there are reasons. I have affection for battle system, and I think it can really be integrated into games. But I think there's a reason why battle system basically increasingly disappeared, and you have at this point things like this and Mazdacat, and I think one very late Dark Sun product does still go back to it, but it disappears by the early 90s really because essentially players didn't want to put lots of time into what was a miniature game by that time as well, which often meant the adventures you were getting were just here's a way of having some miniature warfare. But yeah, both Freedom and Road to Uruk have very good elements, whilst beginning to be constrained both by the Dark Sun format, which I actually should have mentioned, which is that the format of the flip books, and you see this most painfully with the very good module in the core Dark Sun box, A Little Knowledge, where you end up having linearized stories because the booklet is like, oh, well, flick to here. It's forcing you into a choose your own adventure mode rather than here are all the options. So he's constrained both by that and by the style of the time and the need to head toward a more meta plot or in battle system, a tie-in focused game. These are signs of the company more or less it's most successful, but also you can see the things that begin to go wrong for TSR as they head towards bankruptcy. Then around the same time, I'm 92, so just after Freedom, which I think is 91. 91, yeah. Is ALQ1 Golden Voyages. This is not the first module to go with Al-Qadim. Certainly you've got Land of Fate. City of Delights may also be out by that point. I don't remember if that might be a later ALQ book, to be fair, I don't know. But ALQ1 Golden Voyages it has the DM screen for Al-Qadim, which is a pretty gorgeous thing, though classic. It's a trifold, and yeah, I which is unusable at the table. I cannot use 3-panel cardboard screens; they're too light and small. But ALQ1 is, I think, a really good adventure. I think that it's complicated. There are things about it. There are a bunch of things to do with exactly how some of the mechanics in it are meant to work that are kind of a bit confusing. There are a bunch of things about a bunch of things about the tropes of the Sinbad-esque. I mean, you can also bring up things where you're like, oh, I don't really like how they present this part of the setting or whatever. But I'm just talking about mechanically and as a kind of functional adventure. There are a few mechanical decisions which are a bit kind of literally confusing. I'm not quite sure how they're meant to work, and I think I need to reread it. And there is a subversion of D&D tropes because there's this desire to kind of have this Sinbad-esque adventure where the ship constantly wrecks, terrible things constantly happen. And I think you have to decide to buy into that. It's not railroading in one way, I would say. Some of it does say, to start this adventure, this needs to happen. Railroading. But I think that you can ignore that. That's very easy to ignore. I more mean the tropes of how certain things happen. You have to buy into them and accept that in this D&D game, that happens. And to be honest, the ship sinks and most of the crew die again. And no one thinks, why do these guys constantly shipwreck? So yeah, that's one thing, is that you have to buy into that. Then again, if you read people's basic modern BX afterplays, you often find things where DMs run very tropic and non-crunchy games, and you can see it's why the interest in things like Riot Armor comes up. So I think if you accept those and then accept the rest of the game is D&D as you'd expect it, you find a lot to like in this. It's not really dungeon crawling. There are a couple of dungeon-like environments in it, but mostly there's lots of social elements, there's exploration elements, there are genuine decisions to make. Often there's ways of dealing with multiple factions in the same thing. The environments are really interesting. The puzzles, both literal puzzles and sort of social puzzles, are really good. So yeah, Golden Voyages, I don't quite see it as on the same level as X1, I1, OA1, which are 3 very, very good modules, just as an all-time great. But it's hard not to see this as just beginning to push at that, because it's also, one thing is, it's profoundly not linear in the sense the expectation is that players can go to any island they want and can do any of these adventures or locations in any order, and the adventures put in there are only for you to put in if you want to. They are ways of getting clues for the great treasure into the player's hands, or for them to finally find the great treasure. You can come up with your own as well. And there are plenty of ideas, like adventure seeds in there as well. So I'm saying, oh, this is the adventure, but really it's a sandbox where you go around the islands looking for a great treasure. And this is, I think, by the way, more or less for levels 4 to 9, 4 to 10. It's weird, it's not officially leveled anywhere, and Al-Qadim does have an issue that it has very low level material. Dozen and One Adventures is maybe the only one that says, here, start your campaign here. But yes, so Golden Voyages is a really nice sandboxy environment with lots of interesting things to do. Lots of good mini adventures, 7 mini adventures. or 8, and a really interesting kind of setup. But you have to accept some of the either flaws or limit or tropes, depending on how you see them. The final adventure I know of him doing for TSR before he left very soon after publishing Planescape, is these 2 odd mini adventures for the Price of the Rose and Misplaced Spirit at the back of Sigil and Beyond. Now, for the Price of the Rose is about 2 pages of double column. Misplaced Spirit is a page and a half. Those are both very small. They are shorter, pretty much, than any of these. One of these might be a 2-column thing, but like some of these are like 10 pages. They're very small, and it's frustrating because it's part of the obviously a limitation of space that they're like, we need to get people going. So one is how do they get from the prime material to Sigil, and the other is if they're already in Sigil, how do they get involved in the factional stuff straight away. They're both actually really interesting situations, and you kind of have to imagine them as session-long stories. They are a bit like, and this is a better entry in, I think, if you want to, it's got its limitations, but if you want a better entry to Sigil kind of story, I think the first story in Well of Worlds is probably better, where the first session essentially is classic abandoned wizards house dungeon crawl, which ends up them for getting trapped and going to Sigil. That is a trapdoor, I grant, but players don't have to do it. They can just decide not to go into that room. For the Price of the Rose is quite cute. A lady's like, the noble lady is like, my roses keep disappearing, and I think my guards just aren't like catching them, and so I want to get more help. And she doesn't want to accuse the guards of having done it or of having fallen asleep, because that'd be like socially awkward. So she hires adventurers to look into it, and it turns out that the roses are being cut and used as portal keys to get to Sigil and back for a gang of thieves who are planning to steal stuff. That's really cool, and the players can discover that. It is basically, though, 2 scenes. That's the main point, is that it's essentially and then maybe a 3rd scene functionally. I have stolen from that because Stronghoof the Barrier meets the prime materials as they come in and looks after them, and Stronghoof is good. But yeah, and it sets up a few different things that can happen back in Sigil, a couple of factional points. Can you get back home? How do you deal with these thieves you frustrated? And the other one is basically a Chinese spirit has arrived in Sigil and has not gone to the place she should go, to be processed and enter into the afterlife. Golden Morning Radiance, like Sigil, doesn't want to leave, and a minor clerk has been sent by Yen Wang Ye, has sent, well, in fact, I think it's that he has gone away, and a clerk has found out why, whilst the God of the Dead is away, that things gone wrong, and they need to find this petitioner. And so you've got faithful servant Lee wants you to help him find Golden Morning Radiance. Golden Morning Radiance doesn't want you to take her away. She's involved with the Bleak Cabal, who are looking after her. She's not actually a Bleaker, but she's involved with a faction. And there are 2 other factions who also have interest in her. One of whom wants to punish her for having broken celestial law, the Mercy Killers, and the other of whom, the Dustmen, are like, hey, she's a free petitioner, she should come and join us because we align with her philosophy. So there are 4 or 5 factions, because really Golden Morning Radiance isn't a Bleaker. There are 5 factions to play with. It's something where if TSR had been so efficient with all their ideas as to get every idea into a page and a half or 2 pages, maybe we would excuse the limitations of that format, just because there'd be so many ideas out there in such a small quantity of space. But it is kind of a limitation that in the end you've read all these books and then you have 2 quite nice ideas, one of which is really just 3 scenes, and the other of which is a bunch of suggested social interactions with no detail and a couple of stat lines. But it shows how inventive Cook was. And I think when you look at that range of adventures from Conan to Arthur Conan Doyle, to a sort of fantasy Kurosawa with the whole gazetteer, to Sinbad, to a couple of planar starters, to slave revolts in a hellish world, I think it's clear that Cook has a lot of range. So when we're talking about the kind of breadth of stuff he did, quantity of stuff he did, both in terms of sheer quantity of models, but also breadth of styles. He's one of the most adaptable writers of old school D&D. I'd say compare him to Gygax. Gygax writes a lot of different adventure genres, but actually stylistically they're all relatively narrow space. That's not a criticism of Gygax, but actually Cook has a wider range of literary genre to play with. Again, he executes a lot of it really well. I'd say OA1 really good. I would say X1 and I1 really good. It's notable, by the way, that one thing, despite being, someone who's willing to find good stuff in a lot of the second edition era, and that, I mean, one of the great designers of all time, Bruce Cordell, is a second edition designer fundamentally. The issues of style, editing, formatting go massively downhill in second edition, partly because there's experimentation. Golden Voyages, there's lots of mini booklets. Dark Sun is the flip books. These are interesting innovations that don't quite work. Partly because of that, but partly because there's no sense of compression apart from in this example in that Planescape book. On the other hand, you couldn't claim that first edition and basic was terribly well laid out. It's just compressed, and that helps for flicking quickly between stuff. So yeah, Cook, execution wise, very good in first edition era. Second edition era, often very pleasant, not unclear, at least only rarely unclear, but less impressive. And for innovation, adding to the scope of things that you can do. I mean, some of it is just gimmicks. So, for instance, for the price of a rose and the idea of how would you use a portal key as a tool, that is a very, very minor innovation, isn't it? Even though it's so important for the setting, it's very, very minor. For Dark Sun, he writes the first full-length adventure with the flip books. That is not a particularly positive development, even if it's an interesting attempt. But on the other hand, I think some I1 and X1 are both some of the most open early adventures. There are very few adventures, 1980-81, which are that amenable to so many different approaches and so many different ways of doing things. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but when you consider that Gygax focused so much, perfectly reasonably, on the dungeon and has one big wilderness crawl, really, or two if you count WG4 as well. They're connected, of course, S4 and WG4. So very rarely do other early great designers enter into these big expansive spaces. That's the thing Cook does. And in that sense, he might be seen as one of the pioneers of wilderness design. And in Golden Voyages is, though the different booklets aren't a particularly useful innovation, the idea of the Neo sandbox is a callback to his own earlier work, both in terms of wilderness work, and here it's water wilderness stuff. He gives lots of extra rules for sailing because it will be the first sailing expansion for Al-Qadim, and this is long before of Ships in the Sea, the official sailing expansion. But also for the kind of the piquancy of the encounters. You get that in the Oriental Adventures stuff. You get that in the Dark Sun stuff, both Dark Sun Adventures. You get that in Al-Qadim, and you get that in Planescape, and that's something which I'm trying to think really who's comparable this consistently, but Cook may be one of the most what's the word? So I've said he's the early pioneer of wilderness design. That is a good place to leave it, but there's this other thing. He is the memorable encounter. I don't want to say quirky is almost pejorative, but the memorable and piquant encounter is a speciality of Cook. So yeah, that is David Zeb Cook as an adventure designer, and I think in the top 15 or 20 ever. And that's still a very high ranking. What do you think? Do you hate his work? Do you like it? Are there things I've just forgotten? Are there things I have not liked that you did like? Tell me in the comments. Till next time.